So we ended last time talking about the Ediacaran fauna, those large, soft-bodied creatures that came about after the Snowball Earth episodes. And remember, they were a worldwide phenomenon, but the curious thing is that they still had no hard skeletons. It just appeared that they were soft-bodied creatures pressed into the sediment, and so you just had impression fossils like that. Well, the Proterozoic ends, and then we begin the start of the Paleozoic. The Paleozoic literally means paleo, ancient, zoic life, the time of ancient life. And recall that it is several geologic periods you had to memorize: Cambrian, Ordovician. We collectively call those the early Paleozoic. Silurian, Devonian, we collectively call those the middle Paleozoic, and then Carboniferous, Permian, we collectively call those the late Paleozoic. But let's go to the beginning again. The start of the Paleozoic is important, and there's its approximate start date, but the big thing is that it is the biggest massive adaptive radiation that we know of in the fossil record, because all of a sudden we get lots and lots of things that have skeletons. Sometimes we'll call them just hard parts. You and I, we have skeletons of our bones within our bodies, but think about all the clams and snails and corals and things like that with their hard skeletons, and even other things that you don't really think of as skeletons. Things like insects, flies, butterflies, beetles, they have hard exoskeletons, a hard shell on the outer side of their body. Well, all of these things start appearing at the start of the Cambrian. And it's a two-step process. Before we actually get into the meat of the matter, as it were, there is one other little group that pops up between the Ediacarans and everything else, and collectively we call it the Timonians. And so the next few slides are, well, here's just sort of the rundown of the Timonian right at the beginning of the Cambrian or at the end of the Proterozoic. There's still arguments over that. We start finding a lot of these really, really dinky. You see the size there. They're just a couple of millimeters, and those are the big ones. Little things that you look at them, and if you didn't really put them under a microscope or a hand lens, you'd say, oh, those are just little sand grains or something. But you look closely, and they have biological structures. So they're clearly a form of life, but they're very, very different. Remember, the Ediacarans were large and soft, sometimes over a meter large. These are dinky and small, millimeter size, but they have hard parts. So let's look at them. No scale here, but again, just think that this thing is about a millimeter across, and notice it has a conical shape. It's tapered at the top, it flares out at the end. There are concentric lines on it, and then a regular pattern of pores or openings through it. And then this would be hollow on the bottom end so that a creature would tuck inside this thing. The next one's sort of a little disc shape. It would look like the little pinky nail, a little arched shape, so an animal would be underneath what you're looking at here. And again, notice the very regular pattern of pits and also little bumps over the surface of this thing. And then this one I really like. It looks like a vacuum cleaner hose or something. Again, it's an elongated tube and has very, very sharp concentric lines across the thing. They exist, they are worldwide. When you do find them, they are there by the billions, but then they go extinct. So what are we talking about here? Notice on this time scale, we have time running from left to right. So here's Archean, Proterozoic, and then into what we call the Phanerozoic. Phanerozoic literally means visible life, because this is the time everywhere you start seeing these warm colors where things have fossils. And so that line right there, I've kind of circled it in red, that's a very fundamental line because it marks the time before having no skeletons and after having skeletons. And the Timonians would exist right on that little line right there. And then we step into the Cambrian. The Cambrian plus the Ordovician are what I am going to collectively call the early Paleozoic. They're the first two periods. And if we look at the, if we look at the, get rid of that thing. If we look at this diagram again through time, this is sort of one of those mega evolutionary diagrams. We've got number of families as the y-axis and geologic time over here. There's the start, the Cambrian, and then as this line goes up, we're talking about increasing diversity. Anywhere it drops, that's a decrease, a mass extinction. And so look at the line. We start out right there. No skeletons before this line to the left, and then suddenly skeletons. And so this climbs up and up and up. There's a little deflection downward, right? Notice it is right here above the Cambrian-Ordovician boundary. So that's a small extinction event. Then we have more radiation through the Ordovician, and then at the end of the Ordovician, we have this number 1, which means that it is the first of the big 5 mass extinctions. And so the early Paleozoic collectively is kind of interesting because there's a big massive adaptive radiation, a little extinction event. Then another big massive adaptive radiation, and then a big mass extinction event. So let's think about the Cambrian radiation itself then. After the Timonians disappear, they don't exist anymore today, and certainly not even after that first start of the Cambrian, all of a sudden we get just about every major modern animal phyla that we have today starts being found in the fossil record, and all of them with skeletons. And I say especially trilobites and put it in red because they're the group that's so abundant then that they define. They define the timeline, they define the start of the Cambrian, they dominate the sea floor of the time, as you can see in this artist's rendition. And they're not alone. They're there with a bunch of other things that we'll learn about. There's inarticulate brachiopods. There's the simple jawless fishes. We'll talk about them later. And then especially noteworthy is that most of these things have what are designated as calcium phosphate skeletons. Their skeletons are made of calcium, phosphorus, and oxygen, very much like our skeletons are today. So these things are the first to build skeletons with the same mineralogy that we do today. So we have to ask the question then, well, why evolve a skeleton? Why have one at all? If it's, because really a skeleton requires energy to produce, energy to maintain, why would an organism do this? And you can think of several ideas to answer this question. Perhaps it is to protect from UV radiation. We still, at this time, don't have an atmosphere with as much oxygen as we have today. And today we have this ozone layer, this oxygen layer that protects us from just being fried by the sun's ultraviolet radiation. There would have been even more then. And so perhaps evolving a skeleton was a first early attempt to shield organisms from this ultraviolet radiation. Maybe. Second, it could be that it protects them from drying out. That's simply talking about organisms. If life originated in this near shore area where the tide is in half the day and out half the day, then maybe building a skeleton is just a way to hold moisture in while the tide is out. There's a lot of organisms that live in the intertidal zone today, the littoral area, that do this all the time. So certain snails, they'll be sliming all around when the tide is in. Once the tide goes out, they plot themselves down and really sort of glue themselves to the surface of the rock, and they are air and water tight, and they stay moist that way. Barnacles will completely close up and just wait it out till the tide comes back. There's a possible answer. Another possible answer is that it is a protection from predators, that we start evolving things that eat other things here, and building a hard covering is one first simple way to protect you from the bites or the manipulation for eating from other creatures. It certainly is a natural selection advantage. If you have a hard skeleton and the other organisms around you do not, then an opportunistic predator would always go for those softer creatures that don't have the protection of a hard part. So there would be a natural selection advantage. Sort of like the creature you're looking at here. This thing would have stood about 2 to 3, sometimes the largest one's up to 6 inches tall. And notice it has kind of a swirly shape. Look at the top part. It kind of swirls around. It's like a tornado in time made of all of these thousands upon thousands of little bricks. And then it's hollow on the inside. This is a helicoplacus. And it's one of these Cambrian skeleton builders. And it could have built a skeleton for any of these reasons. There is always the possibility that it has no real answer, that it has no protection value initially, that it was just secretion of waste products, not produce. Secretion of waste products. As an organism is living and eating and metabolizing, it has to remove waste from its body. There are the usual ways of doing that, but really building a skeleton is taking your excess calcium and phosphate and carbonate and all these other things and plastering on your body, so that could be the first answer, and then secondarily all these things become good possibilities to answer this question. What I want to get across here is that there's no answer that we know of. It could be any one of these or any combination of these. The second big question is, why did everything seem to get a skeleton at about the same time? We have the Proterozoic, no skeletons. Cambrian, everything. Why isn't it staggered? Why didn't it be such that, oh, corals get it, and then millions of years later maybe clams get it, and millions of years after that fishes get it? No, it's everything at the same time. And this is an even harder question to answer. When I was a student, so ages ago, the answer was the top one there, that my professor told us water chemistry of the oceans reached some saturation state of phosphate, carbonate. Basically, there was so much runoff of the land, different sort of elements that just made the oceans a soup that was so enriched with phosphate and carbonate that, boom, suddenly everything had this in abundance. It was a waste product for everybody, and they built skeletons at the same time. Nice idea, nice hypothesis, but that could be falsified by the fact that there were many, many thick limestones, which are made of the same stuff, which presumably formed in water saturated in that stuff many millions of years, up to 100 million years before that. So remember that in the Snowball Earth time period, how we know that Snowball Earth ended was that all of a sudden we get these limestones, and yet we didn't get animals with skeletons at that time. So that hypothesis, which was textbook back in my day, is now dismissed, and the new hypothesis, the new possible answer, is that everything gets skeletons at about the same time because suddenly we evolve creatures like this one. Large-scale predators, things that are eating other things on the seafloor. Now this animal is called Anomalocaris. It's about 1 meter long, and this would have been a classic opportunistic predator that went around the seafloor taking bites of everything, sampling everything, seeing what was the easiest prey to get lots of, to enhance its life and move on. And then everything had to deal with this, so everything had a natural selection advantage to get armored up, as it were, with skeletons. Perhaps that's true, not really sure. We have the final major phyla that appears, at least from our perspective, is the phylum Chordata. And chordates are those organisms that have a notochord. It's a rod-like support for a spinal cord, a notochord. And we are part of what's the subphylum Vertebrata, organisms where the bone develops vertebrae that protect this notochord, and that includes all of your favorites like this amphibian, birds, reptiles, mammals like this wolf, and then fishes. But all of those, their ancestry can be traced back to this little wormy creature here on the left. The upper picture is an artist's rendition of it. The lower picture is a fossil of it, and its name is Pikaia. You should remember that name, and it appears in the Cambrian. And because it appears then, evolution continues along, tinkering with this basic body plan to get us all of our beautiful modern fauna today. Let's look at Cambrian ecosystems. They are rather simple. So first thing, you can say that they are mostly calcium phosphate skeletons, as I mentioned before, and they are very, very simple food pyramids. And I know it's not drawn in a pyramid shape, but if you go from left to right at the upper part, you've got algae, primary producing plants. You've got organisms that eat the algae, such as this trilobite here, and then you get carnivores like the Anomalocharus, not drawn to scale, obviously, that then would eat all of these things here. Another interesting thing that appears in the Cambrian is we build the first reefs. If I ask any of you where reefs are, what a reef is, you would say, oh, corals in the tropics, a vacation type place. Part of that's still true in the ancient past, but part of it not so much. Corals were not the big reef builders in the Cambrian. Instead, it was these weird creatures called archaeocyathids. They had a shape, a body plan like this, basically a snow cone, with another snow cone tucked into it, and then sort of little walls that connected it, little pores. And notice this general sort of snow cone shape. It turns out that that is the optimal shape for life in and building of reefs. So corals do this today. Archaeocyathids did it first. They go extinct at the end of the Cambrian. But then throughout geologic time, many different organisms build this shape. Their skeletons evolve towards this general shape. And so archaeocyathids do it, corals do it, sponges do it, bryozoans do it, clams do it, brachiopods do it, some snails do it. A conical shape is a good way to build and hold a body upright in this sort of high energy, high turbulence, nutrient-rich environment that are the reefs. But the good times end at the end of the Cambrian. As I said at the beginning, there are several mass extinctions. They're not really mass. They're mass, but they're not big. And so there's several pulses of these, but we have no real cause. We're just not sure. There's just a time period where the Cambrian organisms that dominate start going extinct, and then they are replaced by different organisms. And so these calcium phosphate skeleton organisms, like trilobites, they suffer and they get replaced by a different mineralogy, a different chemistry for the skeletons, calcium carbonate. And that is the type of skeleton that's dominant today. It doesn't mean that calcium phosphate creatures go fully extinct and disappear. They still exist. We are calcium phosphate skeleton creatures. Fishes are. There's other things in the oceans that are, but they don't become the dominant creatures after the Cambrian. Afterwards, it's calcium carbonate. So we go into the Ordovician. And what about the Ordovician? What happens there? As you remember from that mega evolutionary diagram at the beginning, a new adaptive radiation starts. And look at this artist's rendition of an Ordovician seafloor. You have it once again littered with life, but there's more and more different types. And you see more swimming creatures, more creatures that are not tied to the bottom, more mobile creatures, not just trilobites, but there's snails, there's other things, more attached creatures, there's crinoids, there's corals. Life bounces back. And life also starts getting more complex. Cambrian ecosystems were very simple. Algae gets eaten by simple consumers, gets eaten by one or a couple top-level carnivores. In the Ordovician, all of those things expand and we get more and more variety. But if we look at this period, this is just the start of a roller coaster ride throughout the Paleozoic. PZ is my abbreviation for Paleozoic. And on the left side, I list the adaptive radiations, the flowering of life, the time periods where life gets more and more new species. Evolution gets into high gear. And then on the other side, the right side, I show the mass extinctions. And so from left to right, you go from a Cambrian radiation to an end Cambrian series of extinctions. An Ordovician radiation to an end Ordovician mass extinction, Silurian Devonian radiation, end Devonian extinction, Carboniferous Permian radiation, end Permian extinction. And I've marked in red these three, the end of the Ordovician, end of the Devonian, end of the Permian. They are part of the big five, meaning the huge mass extinctions. And so look at this. Life is a roller coaster. Make lots and lots of species, kill them off. Make lots and lots of new species, kill them off. Make even more, kill them off. The Paleozoic is a time of multiple natural selection inventions. Life is trying so many different ways to exist and succeed and thrive, and then there are these pulses where things get killed. And they all have different sort of things that drive the killing over here. So over here, the adaptive radiations, it's mostly just life doing natural selection, evolving into new ways to live and eat and exist. Over here, the killing is from different sources throughout. Now I want to talk about one potential thing that is forcing the adaptive radiations, and that is our friend plate tectonics. So we covered tectonics before, and remember, it's important for creating barriers, which enhances evolution and speciation. And I just got through telling you that the Paleozoic was a time period of many, many different radiations. And so we early on looked for a connection between these radiations and plate tectonic activity. And it turns out that the tectonic activity is important for the rising and falling of sea level, which we also talked about in terms of facies before. So let's look at the impact of plate tectonics. We already know that plate tectonics changes where continents are over time. But as it's doing that, as it's pushing continents around and separating and creating ocean basins, it's doing a couple of things. It is forcing sea level to both go up and to go down. And in a general sense, if you increase plate motions, if you put plate tectonics in high gear, it forces sea level to rise and flood the land. If you slow down plate tectonics, if plate tectonics stops for different periods of time, really mostly just slows down, sea levels drop, and the seas, the ocean water drains off of the land. In general, if sea level rises, that is good in the oceans. It produces adaptive radiations. Now today we are very concerned that if our human activities are melting the polar ice caps and forcing sea level rise, that it's going to hurt us, and it will. It's going to flood Boston, New York, Miami, Washington, D.C., whole countries in the Pacific Ocean. But that's for land creatures like us. For ocean creatures, that is good. It literally provides more real estate for them to live in, and all kinds of new little microenvironments and barriers that drive evolution in a positive sense. So let's look separately at the subject of paleogeography, literally ancient geography. And your book and every geology book that covers this subject usually has a whole bunch of these maps. And notice you've got the outline of the map you know here. So there's the lower 48 states, there's Canada, the provinces of Canada, there's Alaska. But then overlaying on this are patterns of blue and then other warmer colors. And the blues represent oceans, and notice they are covering places that we consider and know of as land today. The brown would be areas that are exposed as land. So let's look at this process. I put this slide in here just to show, well, what's happening with sea level rise. This is the southeastern part of the United States. You recognize Florida, but there's also Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas. And in the lower left of each of these figures, you see the amount of sea level rise that's shown by the red color here. So if sea level went up 1 meter, so for this figure in the upper left, 1 meter would flood these places that are shown in red in this picture. So parts of Louisiana, parts of Florida. If sea level went up 2 meters, notice more of Louisiana, more of Florida, parts of the Carolinas start going. 4 meters, and we're losing more. 8 meters, we're losing huge portions of all of these states. Remember, though, this is 8 meters, and we've talked about this when we talked about facies. Sea level in the geologic past, there's evidence that it has gone up over 100 meters, 120 meters, 150 meters, perhaps more. So huge portions of this map, the green, would be covered completely by seawater. Let's look at how the world was in the Cambrian. You see again the outline of North America here. The blue represents ocean. The darker the shade of blue means the darker or the deeper the water. And then the brown here represents the ancient North American continent, the Canadian Shield. The red line is the equator, and that simply means that this part, North America, is tilted such that it's lying sideways right at the equator. There is Lake Michigan. Right now where I'm putting the cursor, that's where Whitewater, Wisconsin is, and you see that we are right near this transition from land to ocean in the sandy bottom area. And how we know all of this is that if you go anywhere on this map today, sample the local geology for the Cambrian time period, and we tell that by the fossils that are in it, then you would find evidence of ocean life and not land life. And you would find, here it says sandy bottom, meaning you'd find sandstones. Carbonate bottom, you'd find limestones. Muddy bottom, you'd find shales or mudstones out here. So there's the Cambrian. Notice how much land is here. Now look what's going to happen. Let's go to the Ordovician. What's happened? Sea level has risen. There's a huge transgression. So remember that word transgression equals sea level rise. We are still equatorial here in Wisconsin, but now all of Wisconsin is covered by water. There's still land in other parts of North America, but the sea has flooded this, and there is shallow water over most of North America. That is great for ocean life. So life in the tropics, shallow water everywhere, all kinds of places to erect barriers, new microenvironments for life to evolve. That corresponds well with what we see in the fossil record. Look over here again. Let's get rid of that. We've got the rise and fall of life here, and in the Cambrian, life is radiating. We flood the land in the Ordovician, and there's a bigger radiation here. So our story of rising sea level correlating due to plate tectonics, correlating with increase in life still holds. But then we have the mass extinction. The first of the big five happens here. And as far as we're concerned, the end of the Ordovician is due to a climatic change. So we get an ice age, but instead of affecting life in a positive way, as it did with the snowball Earth period, these are more advanced, more susceptible organisms that live all over the Earth now, and a huge climatic change caused by ice, not covering the whole planet, but just the southern hemisphere, small portion of the southern hemisphere around the pole, we think is enough to cause this mass extinction. If we look at the plot of it, the red line is plotting surface temperature, and then this is time as the x-axis. They vertically mark, this dashed line marks the boundary between the Ordovician and the Silurian, and we have evidence that the sea surface temperature decreased throughout the Ordovician and then takes a huge drop at the end here as these glaciers grow. The green line represents biodiversity, number of genera, and notice there's an increase. We have this sort of life is good, even though temperatures are declining, sea level is still high, and then we have this tremendous drop right here. Life dies off, but then it bounces back quickly. This is the first of our big roller coasters, one of the big drops right here, and then comes back. Do not forget that there are two major causes of sea level change: plate tectonics, which pushes sea level up as tectonic activity increases, but also climate. So if glaciers are built, they drop sea level. If glaciers melt, they raise sea level. And life is kind of a patchwork of times where tectonics is pushing sea level up and down, doing it what it does, and the climate is changing from what we call ice house to greenhouse conditions, causing sea level change to go up and down in its reasoning. There are time periods where both are causing sea level to go up, and then you flood huge portions of the land, like what's shown over here. There are other times where both are forcing sea level to drop down, in which case the water would drain out and the land portions of the world would be bigger. There's some time periods where tectonics is forcing sea level to go one way and climate is forcing it another way. And that potentially just makes sea level stay the same or change very little. But we're going to look at this throughout time and talk whenever we hit ice ages, and there's several of them. We're going to talk about, well, what's causing it, tectonics or climate.